Hello, everybody. All right, I think someone's going to introduce us. So,
Hey, hello, welcome back from our break. It's great to see everyone ready for the panel. Today, Nouritzi will be our moderator for this panel discussion, and we have a mix of lovely GNOME and KDE faces to give us some great information on increasing users and revenue.
awesome. Thank you so much, Allison. And so to, I guess, further introduce ourselves, I thought we'd start off with some quick intros. So I will ask the panelists to each quickly tell us your name, where you're currently based, what open source projects you belong to or how you're affiliated with open source, and a highlight from this pandemic. Sometimes we focus on the bad stuff, so let's think about something good that came out of it. Let's see. ANIQA, can you please go first?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is ANIQA, and I'm working for KDE right now as a marketing consultant. And I think this pandemic has helped us a lot. Right now, we're having this virtual session. And I think before we would have never thought about it, we might have traveled. And I think this has made a little bit of things easier for us.
Awesome, thanks. I'll just go down the way that the photos are organized. So Cassidy, you're up next. Let's see. Yeah, hand waving. All right. Perhaps you can test or it's okay. Don't worry about it. We, as you figure out your audio settings, maybe. Oh, there you go. Perfect.
Okay. Yeah. So there's this leave audio button in the middle. That's really not smart design. Anyway, sorry. I'm Jos, and Josh. Yeah, it all works for me. I live in Berlin. I'm maybe semi all-time KDE contributor. Quite a while ago, mostly helping in the marketing team, and later also contributed to OpenSUSE. I currently head up marketing at Nextcloud. And for us, Corona has been, I guess, less disruptive than for most companies. We already worked from home. And I think the highlight is a bit that we really helped a lot of companies, and I'm guessing also a lot of private home users to work from home, to work remotely, of course, while protecting their privacy, security, and all that. So people also care more about it now. I guess they're more aware of, like, if you suddenly have all your stuff, or you have to work remote, then people care more about how safe the data is, which I think is a bit of a plus, given privacy, being under threat. So.
Great, thank you. And I just will introduce myself too, just so that everybody knows who I am. My name is Nouritzi, and I'm based in California in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I first got introduced to open source really through GNOME and my work with Endless. And now I'm working on a lot of more like cross open source initiatives. For example, the Chaos project, where we're trying to develop open source metrics. And a highlight from my pandemic is also kind of the connection. My sister, who has been based in Los Angeles, was able to come up and work from the Bay Area. And so it was so nice to see her for a few months. Really enjoyed my little sister. So we are going to dive right into these questions. I love that, you all are from organizations, that very much oftentimes, people will think of open source as being a place for developers. And I think in recent years, we've started to change that terminology into more contributors. And I just noticed that you all have great backgrounds or are involved in things like marketing, design, business, the legal aspect of things. And so I wanted to hear a little bit more from you about how your backgrounds are contributing to the FLOSS projects that you're involved with, how important that is, and how it's contributing really to the Linux ecosystem's growth. And then how can we attract more people who identify, from backgrounds like yours? And I'll open it up to panelists, anybody who wants to start off. And if not, I'm going to kill you.
So, boy. So the problem is there are too many lawyers. I mean, it's a little bit of a joke, but it's also, you know, it's interesting. I got involved in all this. So when I very first got involved when I first got involved, open source as a phrase was still a few months away from being coined. So when I got involved, it was free software, and we really thought that lawyers were really important, and that you needed them to help structure how people worked with each other, right? The licenses we thought were really central, and you know, and I think the good news for the community, the bad news for me, though it's been great, is that you know, I think we've realized that the lawyers should play a much more background role, right? Where we are there for defense, which the GNOME Foundation has needed a couple of times, certainly. But by and large, the legal tools are either mostly already done or much less relevant than we thought, right? That the other community aspects, things like marketing, we did have a GNOME marketing team briefly in the early 2000s. Suffice to say, what y'all are doing now is a lot more organized and a lot more powerful. And, you know, like that's, I think it's actually really a good thing that lawyers are much less a focus than they used to be. So.
Cool. Thank you for that insight. Yeah, and I completely agree with you. I think that KDE and GNOME's marketing over the last few years especially has been given more of a focus, I'd say. So we have some people who are involved in that. Do you want to just talk a little bit more about some of the challenges that you're facing with marketing open source? Or some of the things that you've seen that are really positive and you'd like to see more of?
I don't want to barge in because I know ANIQA does, of course, marketing in KDE. But at least from a Nextcloud perspective, I can say a few things. I mean, in the end, when you're running an open source project, in the end, it's a software project like any other, and you have a kind of a battle for the hearts and minds of users, so to say, right? There are multiple solutions, and people have to pick. And plain and simple, they have to find what you have, and they have to get the idea that it fits what they need. So the very basics of marketing, which is just to communicate a product, is something you obviously need. And beyond that, of course, you have a huge advantage that often you have a big community, people who talk about the product, who tell other people about the product. And I think this is how open source or free software in the beginning became really popular. And this is still, I think, really core to how open source communities spread their software. I mean, it is for us. But you still need to go beyond that. I am a strong believer in a need for a commercial push behind open source projects. I think it's very hard to become successful without full-time paid people, and full-time paid people means, well, you got to earn money somewhere. You can, of course, rely on donations, but that only gets you so far. And that means you need to reach people who can pay. Now, obviously, private users can pay a bit, but companies tend to, you know, be a much more suitable target. And yeah, I mean, how many companies are you going to get by, you know, advocacy of private users? Some. Absolutely, you can't ignore that. But in the end, when you talk to, you know, a business person, it's going to be very hard to convince them of an open source solution without having some, marketing, both materials, videos, everything, like the whole range. This is just necessary. So I think for an open source project to go beyond, you know, one or a few people coding in their free time, and to become something that really influences the world. And I mean, I don't speak for everyone, but for me, that's motivation, right? I want to make an impact beyond, I don't know, myself. If you want to do that, you need marketing, and you need people who write documentation, and you need basically everything beyond the code, because just code isn't going to cut it. My sense.
Definitely. Okay. And I wonder, I know that ANIQA, the KDE team has experienced growth in the marketing team. Can you tell us a little bit more about specifically, again, maybe how KDE is approaching marketing and kind of your plan moving forward for it?
I think for me, I will use myself as an example because I'm a very newbie for open source society. And for me, it was very difficult to understand how things work. So I keep myself as an example. If you're approaching a person who's not a Linux user, how are you going to actually ask them to join this Linux desktop environment? So I think now we are, as you know, I got in touch with you also, we are trying to reach out more of the local communities. How are they going to help us to reach out to more users? Because, for open source society, you can't just have a simple kind of marketing. It's not just that you can just, have promotions over the social media, that will be enough. That is not, because you need a snowball technique, you need people who can actually reference one another. So the best thing is, which I think a lot of communities have already done, ambassador programs and reference programs. For some it was successful, for some it was not. And for KDE, that's why we are starting the KDE network program. Hopefully we'll be able to roll out in a few months, and our pilot study will start from India. And the whole idea is to start from one user and who can actually bring on more users on board. So that's the whole idea.
Cool. I completely agree with you. I think when I first started at GNOME, I also tried to start a group in San Francisco specifically, and had a lot of women interested in joining from backgrounds actually like lawyers who wanted to get out of law, and people who maybe had taken a break in their career and wanted to start learning how to program, and thought that open source would be a great way to do that. And when I tried to explain what GNOME was, I was, new to the community too. I didn't have great stories and people were kind of like, okay, I don't totally get why this matters, or like what I'm doing. And so I think that we have already improved our stories, but storytelling is so important in this, and we have to find new ways to reach audiences that are totally new to this space and so may need more understanding of why it matters and how to do it, and rewards. Companies do that as well. So kind of along with that, thinking about Linux desktop technology is not necessarily the hot new tech that everybody wants to jump into, and paired with we have to find innovative ways. Have you engaged in any innovative ways to reach new users, or know of others that you think our communities should try? And I'm thinking of you, Clarissa. I know that you mentioned that you're starting a program around this. Maybe you can lead off and others can join.
Yeah, I totally can relate with you about trying to explain why do we contribute to open source to people who are not they don't live that day by day. So it's very hard to explain that for them. I'm not very good at, I don't know, making sort of a marketing and spreading the love of open source for people. So it was really hard for me to explain them that, so yeah, we are running this initiative that we want people to get engaged in open source, especially from Brazil, because we have lots of people there. Like, the population of Brazil is giant, but we don't have many people involved with open source. So we wanted to reach Brazilian community. We wanted to grow the Brazilian community in open source and give them autonomy to contribute to whichever open source software they wanted to. But first we had to talk to tell them what open source is and why should they contribute to open source. So it was a very big challenge, but in the end they got it, and most of them are getting engaged. And I think the most important thing that we did for them was to tell them that they are needed, you know, that their work matters, and we need more people to take part on that, and that every work that, even though they are beginners, even though they are going to different fields like marketing or usability, they can get, they have something to offer to any community, because everyone has the capability of doing anything that they, I don't know, everyone has skills to offer to the community. So, and adding to the other question, I think, especially talking about usability, I had no background on usability. I was like the opposite that we expect. I am a software engineering student, so I was all like developing and stuff and coding. But I saw an opportunity of learning usability by doing usability tests for GNOME, and I had no background on design or usability or stuff like that. And I was able to just like like I was a user for GNOME. Like I used GNOME for many years before I started contributing, and just by being a user, I was able to contribute to usability testing like an user, like a beginner. So yeah, I think anyone should try to learn a little bit about usability and run usability tests. So anyone has the skills to do it. You just gotta search for your field.
Sorry, I thought I was unmuting myself, and I muted myself. I was just going to say, yes, I completely agree. And I love that idea that, you know, you might have skills or superpowers that you didn't even realize, you know, and just by being in an open source community or being exposed to this, you might say, hey, I can contribute in this way that I didn't think was possible. And you can start, you know, a whole other side that you never knew was possible. So, that's great. And Cassidy, I know that you know, you're also involved in interesting ways to reach new users. Elementary has had some really great success. Do you have anything to add here? And if not, we'll just kind of move on.
Yeah, absolutely. Really, to attract new users especially, you really need to focus on the experience and creating the best product, period. People don't use software because it's open source. At least the vast majority of people on Earth don't use software because it's open source. You compete with that proprietary software by making a better experience and by competing in areas in which the proprietary software can't compete, which is, for example, privacy. You can never have a truly privacy respecting piece of software if it's closed source or if it's proprietary. So we need to lean into that and focus on, you know, creating the best experience you can, and focus on competing in ways that you just can't compete with the alternatives.
Yeah, I think people are plus oneing you. Totally agree. Cool. So one of the questions that I have is around collaboration. So, you know, we're all doing our best to create, you know, great experiences. I think that there's a lot of opportunity for, again, other backgrounds to get involved, product managers to come on in, and you know, UX specialists, et cetera. But, you know, as we think about increasing the users around the Linux app ecosystem, where do you see opportunities for communities to collaborate? And then what do you think is something that individual projects really need to take on them by themselves?
If I may speak a little bit from a kind of outside perspective, because we as Nextcloud, I mean, we are all people from the KDE and GNOME community in the company, or at least a lot of us are, as well as from other open source communities. But of course, now we're, well, a third-party project, and one of the things we do is we build an app, the desktop client, also mobile clients. And, you know, if you want to grow an app ecosystem, I mean, there's a pull and a push. You know, like there's a benefit of building an app for an app developer, which is, in simple terms, reaching people. And there's a cost, which is how hard it is to make an app available for the platform and make it work everywhere. And if I get to complain a tiny little bit, you know, there is, of course, still issues with standards, like in our case, notifications and system tray. Like GNOME and KDE developed a standard for a system tray, but it's not supported by GNOME as far as I know. So our app, which uses a system tray, doesn't really work in a logical way for a lot of GNOME users. And that kind of issues, I mean, I get that the desktops and well, those who built the platform, so to say, they want to innovate, you want to move forward. You don't want to be held back, perhaps with legacy things, but that does mean you lose independent app developers. And you got to really balance that in a smarter way, and work with others in this regard, because this increases the costs. And you know, we all know that the user base of Linux desktop isn't great, isn't huge. Luckily, I think there is some exciting momentum. I have a couple of small PC vendors that seem to be growing and becoming more prominent. And there are the bigger ones, Dell and Lenovo, of course. I really kudos to the people who made that happen. I don't know who deserves the credit, but they really deserve a few pats on the back, because that really makes a sizable difference. I mean, when I got involved in open source, getting a laptop to work, I mean, I wrote blogs about it because it was weeks of work, and now you can just buy one from Dell and Lenovo, which are, you know, huge companies. So that's really helpful, I think. But yeah, for this, you have to offer a consistent single platform. Yeah, having a single website. Like if you want to develop for Apple, you know, you go to apple.com/developer or developer.apple.com, wherever they put it. But there's one place where you can get started, you know. And Microsoft, the same story, although they have, I think, 600 different UI toolkits and everything. But still, there is one way you can do it. And on Linux, there's a way for GNOME, but that app will not be smooth on KDE and the other way around. Yeah, that's not good, and that should be fixed, I think, because you're splintering a platform that is already tiny even further. I mean, from a business point of view, any investment we do in Linux support is already quite a stretch, you know. If you then also have to do it for 2, 3, 4 desktops, only crazy people do it. We're crazy, luckily, but you know, most companies are not, and they don't. And you know, and if you go beyond that, I mean, I know we've done a lot with things like you know, Flatpak and all these things, and that helps, but they're also not there yet. You can't do browser integration, file manager integration, for example, from a Flatpak. Yeah, so if you get the Flatpak or the Snap or the app image from Nextcloud, you don't get this nice right-click menu in your file manager. Yeah, and we can't really fix that. You know, that's just a technical limitation. So there's also technical barriers that, I mean, again, yeah, that should get more attention, I think, from the people who built the platform.
Yeah, please jump in. You can unmute yourself and just go.
All right. So yeah, I have thoughts on this as well. I think growth of the Linux platform in and of itself might be a red herring. You know, we could port the whole world to Linux. We could have Android apps and Electron apps and iOS apps and Windows apps, and we could grow the Linux platform in that way. But to have sustainable growth, I think you need to actually have a platform. And Linux is not a platform, and which is fine. Like Linux is, you know, there's this open source ecosystem, there's this Linux ecosystem, Linux desktop ecosystem, but there's the GNOME platform, and there's the KDE platform, and there's the elementary platform, etc. And we can all have similar and overlapping ideas and goals and opinions and go about things different ways. But really, I think to make a good experience for both users and developers, you have to focus on growing an actual platform. I know that's hard to hear because it also means, like you said, kind of splintering the Linux ecosystem further. But unless we say, all right, let's KDE, GNOME, elementary, let's all join forces, make one distribution, one toolkit, one platform, which I don't think is going to happen anytime soon. I think we really have to focus on those individual platforms as separate platforms. And again, we can still work together on things when it makes sense. But I don't know if it's realistic or worthwhile to say I want an app for Linux, and because that's so broad, that can mean so many different form factors and platforms. Whereas if you say I want an app for KDE, that's a much better target. You know, I want an app for elementary OS. That's a much more simple target. And for cross-platform apps, they can say I want an app for KDE and an app for elementary OS and an app for GNOME, and those are 3 different apps on 3 different platforms. Just like a Windows app is different from a Mac OS app, is different from an Android app, is different from an iOS app. So I don't know that it's realistic for the foreseeable future to say a Linux app is a singular app that works the exact same everywhere. And I think we have to be okay with that.
Yeah, but you can't justify spending time on it already, you know, with like a 3% market share. If you then cut that in 4, it's even harder. Like what person in a business can go to the boss and say, hey, we can sell 4% more if we do X amount of work. Like this is a conversation that happens if you want third-party apps. I'm sure, you know, Elementary and GNOME and KDE can all build a new image viewer for themselves. Fine. But let's be honest, that's not going to be helpful in day-to-day work a lot. You also need more specialized apps. And if they have to rewrite the app or at least do a lot of work to target each of the platforms, then a lot of platforms aren't going to get targeted. You know, I mean, you've seen this with Ubuntu. I mean, most third-party applications, think of Steam, that just say, we support Ubuntu. If you get it running on Fedora and OpenSUSE, good for you. But we don't support it. Goodbye. Have a good day. Because they just target the biggest. And that's reasonably sensible, I think, from a business point of view. You can say, well, we don't care about that. All right. Then, you know, there aren't going to be a lot of apps for you, and your users can then complain about that. But, well, that's because you didn't want to build a platform that works for app developers.
Okay, any final thoughts on this topic? I know we can go on for ages.
Yeah, I mean, we can go on for a long time on this.
Yeah.
We can literally go on for decades on this topic.
Yes.
I do want to point out that it's something I said in chat that I think is probably worth for some of the viewers who aren't paying attention to chat. You know, there's some tension between Cassidy saying, you know, nobody uses this stuff because it's open. They use it because it's, you know, high quality or whatever. And Joss saying, only crazy people do this. And then pointing out that there are, in fact, crazy people who do this, right? And the motivation for those people is almost always about it being free, open, you know, privacy protecting, et cetera, right? Like there are, you know, I think if you look at the history of this movement, you know, yes, of course, many of us care, and to reach a broad market, right? You know, I don't think Cassidy's wrong, right? To reach more than the 4% of the market or 3% of the market or whatever, you do need to have a story that is bigger than, hey, you can open it up and see what's inside. But at the same time, I think it's a valuable tool that free and open source desktops have that Apple and Microsoft don't, is this ideological motivation, right? And so what do you, how do you, I've been trying to stay away from crazy because it has all kinds of connotations, but like, how do you cultivate and tend to that group of people who do believe in this ideological motivation? How do you grow that as sort of a sub-community within the larger community? Because that's a potent, powerful, intelligent, caring group of people that I think sometimes when we've had this pendulum about like, are we pragmatic? Are we ideological? Like, how do we make sure that we're keeping some of those core values there, because they do motivate people, and they do, it's really helpful to have some people doing things for irrational reasons. If everybody's doing it just for like the cold, sane, and here I am at a VC-backed company, right? So I'm like trying to do things for cold and sane and reasonable reasons, but like also, that additional push of, I really think it's the right thing to do, helps get some people out of bed in the morning, and helps, and if that helps people put in an extra hour of marketing or coding or whatever, that can be really powerful. That adds up over time. And so I would urge everybody watching this to make sure you do have to have the cold, pragmatic view, but like also figure out ways to nurture and guard that ideological strand, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be the core of what we do, but it does have to be, it can be real and powerful if we take it seriously.
Yeah, thank you for that, Louis. And that kind of leads into one of the questions that the audience has asked, which is more oriented around monetization, but it's about, how should we start to monetize and still respect open source and privacy. There are things like, advertisements, donations, in-app purchases, etc., that can happen, but how can we move towards this while still upholding our FLOSS values?
So there's nothing inherently inherent about free and open source software that means you can't pay for it, right? And there's also this myth, Daniel Frey, founder of Elementary, says there's this myth that open source software is all written by benevolent volunteers and that funding the development of software somehow corrupts it. That's something we see a lot within the really diehard Linux kind of places on the internet, I guess. And I think we need to get over that. We need to get over that money somehow corrupts open source software, or that you can't ask for money. And we need to not be afraid to build the tools to allow users to give open source projects money. Right now, that's, I think, one of the biggest barriers, is that you go to an app store on your phone and you pay money for an app. You pay $1 or whatever, or you sign up for a subscription, and it's really easy and simple. But there's no way to do that on the desktop, at least broadly right now. At the Elementary AppCenter, we've started in that direction, but GNOME software and KDE Discover, as far as I know, there's no way just to go click a button and pay $1. So I think we really need to focus on those pieces of building the tools to allow people to give open source projects money, and I don't think that is in conflict whatsoever with the free and open source values.
Okay. So, talking about ways that we can monetize and create rewards for, the development to continue, the creation of apps to continue, and then also, for sustainability, I'm wondering what are you all, using for yourselves, and what are some ways that we can continue to make the the development of applications more sustainable? I know some of you, like Louis, are involved directly in helping the FOSS ecosystem be more sustainable. So can you tell us a little bit more about that and your thoughts?
Yeah, sure. I mean, let me give the sort of basic Tidelift elevator pitch, which is that, but it's focused on libraries. right? So like our basic observation is that all big companies are now software companies, and all software companies are open source companies. And so, you know, literally a $1 trillion industry built on top of open source. And yet at the same time, piles of this open source that these companies rely on becomes unmaintained every year because people aren't paid directly to work on it. And so they get a new job, or they get a puppy, or they get a toddler, and all of a sudden this side project becomes much less important. And then when the side project becomes important, it eventually gains security problems. It just isn't ported to new APIs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think everybody here understands that basic cycle. So our observation, inspired in part by Red Hat, which my other co-founders are all ex-Red Hat people. I'm technically ex-Red Hat, but I spent more time at SUSE than I did at Red Hat. The observation was, if we can measure this, we can capture what people are doing and pay out based on that. It's almost, you know, for those of you who are familiar with like Spotify and how they pay artists, similar to that. The intuition is we capture what you're actually using. We measure that, and we redistribute the money you've paid to us to developers whose software is being used, and we do that based on essentially, I mean, the short version of it is analysis of your package manager metadata. And and we require the developers to do basic stuff around security, licensing, all that. Basically, the enterprisey stuff that is sort of boring, that is not something you'd want to do on a Saturday morning for fun. And you know, we turn that into a revenue stream. The challenge for this audience, unfortunately, is that we just don't see enough usage of free software at the application layer, and we don't have a way to track it, right? And so our model, at least as of yet, doesn't really allow us to say, for example, you know, are you using the Firefox web browser, which is free, versus the Chrome browser, which is free, and you know, donate revenue based on based on that usage, right? And so it's a tough, you know, and especially for organizations that are still primarily at the desktop level, everybody's an open source software organization at this point, but that's all on the back end, right? That's not what developers are using in their day-to-day primarily. It's not what the business people in the organization are using day-to-day. And so extending that pitch up the stack, we would love to do it at some point, but we don't see, you know, quite where it fits yet in our model, which is really unfortunate because, you know, several of us, one of my other co-founders is Havoc Pennington, who some of you may recognize from, you know, vestigial docs on FreeDesktop.org. You may have seen his name in, you know, those kinds of things. Yeah, so it's a hard fit, right? I do wonder, you know, having also worked at Mozilla and at Wikipedia, I do always wonder whether or not some of that more user-focused, as opposed to, you know, at the end of the day, our Tidelift's business is very enterprise-focused, right? We are here to get dollars from very big enterprise companies and turn that into money for developers. I do wonder, you know, Wikipedia certainly to great success, Mozilla to less, but still not zero success, has turned their user bases, their human user bases, not their enterprise user bases, into revenue streams. And I do wonder if that's a more fruitful path for, you know, for these communities here, right, for GNOME and KDE.
Yeah. Anybody else on thoughts? I know, Cassidy, you've Elementary has the App Store, so jump in.
Yeah. So especially the Tidelift model is really interesting, and I've always been really fascinated by that. On the desktop, I think it's really interesting because I don't want to take all of the underlying work that goes into the desktop for granted, but there are very, very large successful companies who are very invested in maintaining and improving the Linux plumbing in general. So I think it's important not to get bogged down in, how can we ensure that every purchase of this app written by a starving developer also goes and pays for the Linux kernel, because those are two very different developers or development people in very different situations. And I think as the ecosystem grows, there will be opportunities to reinvest revenue once we actually have revenue for these apps. There will be opportunities to reinvest that into the ecosystem to make sure that our interests as platforms for apps are well represented within the Linux desktop. But I don't think we can pretend it's equivalent to say, for a $1 app from somebody who's just trying to make rent this month, that you need to make sure that whatever percentage of the Linux kernel gets funded and whichever percentage of glib gets funded from that one purchase of that $1 app from somebody who's otherwise not making any money. Yeah.
Sorry, Louis, please go first.
It's just a real quick point, which is that the only reason we believe that kind of trickle down works in the server space is because there's a lot of money in the server space. Completely agree with Cassidy that on the desktop space, taking a small pie and subdividing it into even smaller slices is a very tough sell. I mean, it's tough enough in the server space, and it would be very hard in the desktop space.
Yeah, I basically am completely on board with Cassidy and Louise on this. This is going to be quite hard on the desktop. On the other hand, a part of it is that the pie is small and there's a lot of money in the server. Okay, but if the pie were bigger, as in if there was more use, obviously there would also be simply more money. Now, again, I'm biased. At Nextcloud, we have internally looked at over the years various business models, and we really do not believe that there is much room for earning money on private users. There are a lot of private users of Nextcloud, like really a lot. There are about 300,000 to 400,000 Nextcloud servers on the internet, so people running an actual server. And that's obviously the vast majority of that is just private people running it on an old desktop or Raspberry Pi or a VPS somewhere. And we try to do a lot to make their life easier, to make it easy to update, to make it easy to find it, download it, run it. And we do not do anything to try to monetize it. We really try any idea that comes up internally that boils down to make money on private use. We say, let's not try that, please. Because we think that it is far easier and more effective to try and monetize bigger companies. And I think that same can be true for the desktop. I mean, if big companies, they also need a desktop, right? And they are currently paying for that. That's in the end what it boils down to. There's money getting paid for Windows and Mac OS, indirectly in case of Mac OS, but still. And okay, then you have a bit of a problem, kind of a chicken egg issue, I think, where right now there's just not enough of a movement there that you can build a business on it. I know both Red Hat and SUSE tried to have their, SUSE Linux Enterprise Desktop, I think, and Red Hat Enterprise Linux, I guess, Desktop too. They both tried this, and I think there was definitely some money made, but not enough to really sustain it and to really build up a bigger, pie, basically. Now, part of that is probably that, I guess at some point, I'm sure SUSE went for KD and Red Hat for GNOME, which is like, okay, do you have to split efforts there? But, right, this is, I guess, how this works, and you can debate for a long time whether that was smart or not, and what that did, but it didn't help, I'm sure. But then, even if you can, back to, I think the challenge is the chicken egg here, because there just isn't enough critical mass to do this. Now, one thing I believe is that there's quite a bit of interest from government, interestingly, in pushing open source for privacy reasons, for digital sovereignty reasons, which is a fancy term they throw around these days, which just means controlling your computing, which is obviously what free software is all about. When you go back to the basics, it's about you, the person who or organization that runs the software, controlling it. And that is indeed really important. And right now we're in a situation where half the world is running software that is developed in pretty much one area of the world. And, you know, whether that's good or bad, there's definitely some inherent risk in that, I think. And open source is a prime way of fixing that problem. But of course, governments tend to love to invest through complicated, you know, grants and all that stuff. And I am very skeptical of that. I mean, it can work, I guess, but often, you know, getting money for 6 months and then it disappears again, this is not how you build a sustainable open source project. So a better way would actually be if government would do what it preaches. And what you see right now is that governments all over the world are putting millions, billions into proprietary software. How about stop doing that and put that money in open source? That would definitely, in terms of size of the pie, completely solve the money problem, because there's more than enough money spent in 1 year just by Europe on Microsoft Office licenses. I mean, there's more money going into that than I think all of open source on the desktop and even the whole stack below it spends in a decade. So there's money. It's just being spent on, well, it's basically just going to shareholders, because of course it's not like Microsoft is spending more than 1% of the money that's being paid for Microsoft Office onto the development of it, right? This is, the margins are insane. So I don't know, I'm kind of hopeful that at some point government will wake up and think, so right now we're spending, I don't know, 10 billion a year in just one country on licenses for something that actually could be developed for $500 million in 1 year or two. How about maybe do that instead? I don't know. It's one thing I'm hoping for. I mean, after all, you know, we thought, at least I thought for a long time, that, you know, no hardware vendor of the size of Dell or Lenovo is ever going to ship, you know, open source desktop software ever. And they do today. So who knows? Maybe governments will also wake up someday.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. You know, having worked at Endless for a while, we did actually approach government organizations, and I know that there are some governments that have, you know, started to use more open source, or they have budget for open source, but at the end of the day, you need support for it. You need people that are like actively there, like doing business development, and those relationships take a lot of time because government moves really slow. And I think that's one of the reasons why I personally feel really passionate about this topic, because I think that it's a great training ground for people who have business development skills or sales, or want to like go into like people who are not thought of as the traditional open source contributor can do so much to help. I know Alberto Ruiz had been, you know, really great at helping us find opportunities that, you know, we hadn't thought of at GNOME, and those are incredibly valuable. We need to get more people who want to do that, who excel in doing that, who are very people skill oriented, to go and form these relationships with governments and other, you know, organizations. So totally agree with you. And then I think that the challenge that we have, again, is around service and support, because at least in my experience, that is something that governments expect. And that can be quite, quite a lot of work. And, you know, in a volunteer-based organization, or mostly volunteer-based, you know, it's a little difficult.
I mean, to elaborate on that thought a little bit for people in the audience who haven't worked at those kinds of companies, it's not just that it's hard, it's that it's hard to scale, right? Something that we have used to our benefit in open source is, hey, a handful of us write software and it gets used everywhere. And, you know, new users does not necessarily mean I mean, it does in some cases, but it doesn't necessarily mean more burden on the developers. More users definitely means more burden on support, right? And that's where like support contracts and enterprise class support is. It's not just that it's hard to do well, it's that when you add a new customer, you've also got to hire and train and deploy a new support person, and the next customer means the next, and that's something that is not, to get back to where the conversation started, that's something that needs money, right? Like that is not, you can't really do that support, that kind of support on a volunteer basis.
Yeah, and then I think this, just to combine, both points that were just being made, I think there's also a bit of a sales pitch / attitude issue here, because of course, one argument for open source that's used very often is it's cheap or it's free, which is a horrible argument if you're trying to make a business, right? This is just killing. I mean, so often our sales team, and they're doing amazing work, but so often the main argument that the customer internally has used to deploy Nextcloud was save money. That kills any opportunity for us to build a healthy business that way. And the problem is, of course, a lot of people who love open source and try to promote it will also use this argument, which is quite awful.
And that's where somebody mentioned in chat the public money, public source argument that FSF Europe has been deploying a lot lately, and I think that's a terrific message and goes to your point, Joss, of the European Union.
Yeah.
Okay, I know we only have a few minutes left. I'm not sure this is the best suited for this group, but it has been identified that we need to have more emphasis on a space beyond the Linux App Summit where we can collaborate all together. FreeDesktop.org has been named as, I guess, something that we can try to amplify or to extend, something like that. And do you all have ideas for how we can continue this conversation beyond this space, or how to keep collaborating?
Yeah, I think, honestly, I think FreeDesktop, it gets a bad rap of, it's not a standards body, it's not an enforcement agency or anything like that. But there's still a lot of really good stuff there. The FreeDesktop existing is why there is some amount of intercompatibility between desktops, like when you click an icon, it opens an app, like fundamental things like that. So I think FreeDesktop is probably still the best route. I think it needs maybe to be revitalized and maybe repositioned a little bit as far as what its goals are and how active things are and who's involved with those efforts. But yeah, having intercompatibility between desktops does improve things, and it lets us all kind of have our own visions for what the desktop is, while not totally wasting resources reinventing the wheel every time. So yeah, personally, I'm a big fan of the free desktop angle.
Okay, and
I'll
go ahead.
step back a second and say that there's a community at sustainoss.org, including a semi-active discourse forum that is a gathering hole for people trying to do the money and sustainability and open source discussion. It's very library and developer centric, but it could certainly, for folks around here who are interested in the space, it's certainly a great community of people. I they were trying to do meetups twice a year. Actually, the last thing I did, I think Sri was saying this in chat, the last thing that I did before everything got locked down was go to Sustain, and I assume they'll be doing some online stuff as well. There's also several people doing podcasts around the space that may be interesting for the audience here.
Yeah, I want to second that. I actually myself have that on my to-do list to get more involved, because I think that there's a lot of just great people from both corporations and more traditional or just open source projects that are working together on this. And I think it's a great place to get involved. I see that you added another link in there, Louis. I don't know.
The publiccode.eu is just for those who were the public money, public code slogan that I mentioned. Publiccode.eu is a site with materials and discussion of that slogan. I also want to say, actually, and this relates to Joss's point about free software is low cost. I will say, actually, my one concern with the Sustain OSS community is that often everything is phrased as a donation, and there are certain contexts where donations work. Like I mentioned earlier, for Wikipedia, donations work. But I actually my biggest concern with the Sustain OSS crowd is that the large amount of corporate participation. For the corporate folks, they never want to buy anything. They always want to donate. And there's a reason for that, and that's because they can turn off donations whenever. They can feel good about donations without actually building a sustainable community. And I think that's a message that we all need to push back on, right? That
and
this
taxes,
is,
I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, taxes is, but it's not quite taxes. It's like voluntary. It's like, oh, look, there's a saying in the U.S. Nonprofit world of, oh, I gave at the office, right? It's like this idea that you donated once, and so now you don't have to think about it again, right? And you'll see this. There are a couple big companies in the Sustain ecosystem or the Sustain community who have made these big public pronouncements of, oh, we donate $10,000 a month to one open source project, and and guess what? $10,000 once is not sustainability, right? That makes you feel better, but doesn't actually help that community.
Yeah,
right?
plus it's
it's not bad for that community,
but it's also not much money. I mean, we get companies that reach out to us sometimes, like, we like Nextcloud, we want to support it, we have a donation. And then we sent them a quote, and the quote is easily 100 times what they were even considering to donate. And I'm like, yeah, but like our engineers get a normal salary. They don't get like 5% because they happen to do open source. Okay, I can't charge you 5K a year when you would pay 500K a year for a solution from a proprietary company. Why are we even having this conversation? And this is... this is not helpful. And it's in part we need to change the conversation. And I mean, companies have made progress here. I think a lot of companies and governments, they used to consider free software like freeware, and they had a rule against freeware, and then they said no open source. Okay, that time is luckily past. We're in 2020. This was 25 or something, and then they used it, but they saw it still as like free, it doesn't cost money. And this is something we still need to get rid of. And then we need to teach them, by the way, that when you run open source software, you should get a support contract. And then we're going to have to teach them you should get a support contract with the people who built the software, not some random third-party company on the internet that just happens to know how to configure the software once, but can't actually help you when something breaks. Like, all these things are also a matter of communicating and teaching big companies and governments to understand, how open source business works. And honestly, once 80% of the Fortune 500 has an internal policy that when they use open source, they get a support contract with the vendor, I think running an open source business, even for desktop software, will become a whole lot easier, because suddenly you can just say, look, I make this application, be it Krita, you know, like a drawing application or just a desktop. And, you know, there's an internal policy. If you use it and rely on it, you want to have a contract. Excellent. We offer that contract. And for the server side, this is what Lewis is kind of doing, of course, offering this from what I understand. For the desktop, yeah, we need to teach a lot still, really a lot.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm sorry to do this, but we're out of time. So we're going to have to continue this conversation in the hallway, or, you know, I had seen some people post that they're going, or promise they're going to have blog posts coming out sometime. So keep an eye out for those. Thank you so much for joining this panel. There's lots happening in the chat, so if you haven't had a chance to look at that, please do. And I'm sure there will be a lot of follow-up also exploring the free desktop option that we've mentioned a couple of times. I will end it at that. Thank you so much. And Allison, back to you.
Thanks so much,
Bye.
Nuritsi.
Thank you.
It was great
Thank
hearing
you.
from all of you. Thank you so much for being here today.